Okay, Ginny, then thanks so much for doing this, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I wasn't really sure which way to go with this, whether if everyone is non-specialist or new to teaching, then whether you would want to go through the Latin kind of line by line as you would do with students. But then I saw that Sarah has done a fantastic session like this on Hands Up Education, where she does go through some of the passages like that. So I just thought I'd signpost you to that before this one. So I'm not going to go through each of the passages as I would with students or anything like that. What I wanted to go in the direction of suggesting some activities, some of the sorts of things that I will do with my students. So a bit of context, I teach in a mixed grammar school. So there is an entrance exam, but it is state maintained. And we have quite a wide or a wider selection range than most grammar schools, so that we do have some differentiation. We have a fair amount of SEND students, not loads and loads, but there will be some in each class, and they generally do tend to struggle in particular with Latin as a language, but in particular with the literature. If they find English language tricky, then they can kind of shut down when they see that you're going to do some literature in Latin as well. However, I think that we can use, so for me this year, I'm going to really try and work with the English department, and it helps my husband as an English teacher as well, so I can kind of pick his brains too, about how they teach literature at English GCSE, where we can, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, where we can use some of the skills that the students already have, the language that they already have from English, where we can transpose that onto teaching Latin literature. So this is also, for me, the first time that I'm teaching any of these set texts. I was on maternity leave last year, so I've not taught any of these texts before. So I've spent this summer, you know, it's one of those things where you see the texts have changed and you're like, oh God, the texts have changed, and you've got to spend ages preparing them. So I have just gone through that process myself, and I'm thinking of different activities of how I will teach them to the kids. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. Hopefully you'll find it useful. So I thought the first place to start is really where we want to, what we are trying to develop in the students. So the aims of this session to increase your confidence and hopefully suggest activity ideas. So where do we want to go with the students? Why are we doing this in the first place? So having a look at the Eduqas website and their specification, they want you to be able to not only obviously look at the language of things, they want you to demonstrate an understanding of the history, the cultural context of a text, analyzing and drawing evidence together. And so many of these things, the analyzing and the evaluating, is very similar to things that I think that students know already how to do, or they're already being trained to do in English. So I think that's where we want to try and tap into their prior learning already, but obviously tweak it and make it better, because let's face it, Latin is better than English. So we're also using the literature as a way of accessing the Roman culture as well. So it's not just about making sure that you've got your language completely perfect. It's also about what can we draw from these passages, how can we make this really exciting and bring it to life again. So we want to look at things like the choice of word order, sound effects, rhythm in the verse passages, common literary devices such as simile and metaphor. And that's kind of where I would start when I am starting at the literature scheme of work. But I'll come back to that in a moment. So with the visual sources, now I've taught this already. So with my year 10s, they had their year 10 exam in like June, so we had, or end of May, beginning of June. So we then had this window where I didn't want to carry on with doing any language, and I thought this is a great window of time for me to teach the visual sources as a springboard to then teaching the literature when they come back in year 11 in September. So I chose to teach the 6 pictures at the beginning of the literature prescription. I chose to teach them beforehand in year when they were in year 10. I really enjoyed that, happened to have that free window of time. I appreciate that not everyone has got, that might not happen for me next year either. I might have to teach it much faster, but it was a really nice thing to do in the summer as a kind of, I don't want to say a wind down, but it was after their exams, and they were not going to want to carry on doing any language, and certainly no point starting literature when you only have like 2 weeks, 3 weeks left. So for me, I chose to teach it before I taught any of the other literature pieces. But I suppose it's interesting to consider when is a good time to teach the visual sources. Are you going to teach it before as like an introduction or a warm-up to the literature, so that they've got some contextual historical knowledge before you start the passages? Or do you kind of turn to the pictures as some of the topics arise in the literature itself? So for example, if you were reading one of the passages if you were to start with the Petronius passage and then say, oh, he's walking, his soldier friend was walking amongst the tombs. Well, what might that look like? Let's look at picture 1, which is the picture of the tombs on the side of the road to Herculaneum. So are you going to kind of build it into the literature as you teach it? Or do you teach it at the end after you've taught the literature passages as a way of, well, what do we already know about superstition and magic that we've read in the literature? Can we have a guess at what these objects might be showing? So that's just something for you to consider. Where have you got time? What's your scheme of work going to look like? And really, what's your preference? How's your style of teaching? So I read civilization is one of the things that I really, really love teaching. And one of the best ways that I find to kind of engage the students is to come up with, I attempt to try and find something that's a bit provocative. But none of these questions are, so that's not a very good example. But I like to have a question at the beginning of the lesson to try and kind of bring everybody together and make it seem like we are on a quest for the truth together, rather than it seeming like I've got all the information and you're going to learn it from me. So was a good burial only important for wealthy Romans? I might have that on the board at the beginning of the lesson and perhaps ask for some predictions. Do they know anything about Roman burial already? Students who have done the Cambridge Latin course, I think it's in stage 8 or something, no, stage 7, something like that, of the Cambridge Latin course. So they might have already got some residual knowledge about Roman funerary practices or burials already, so you might be able to draw on that. Someone might have seen something, whatever. So I like to start with a question and then look, that is kind of the focus for each of the different activities, and then we'll revisit that question at the end. So this is a starter activity that I really enjoy doing, having this on the board as the students walk in and they're going, what on earth is going on in this picture? Now, the picture I've chosen is not one of the prescribed images, but it's a really good image. You'll see at the end why I've chosen it. So when I do the slides, I make sure I have a transition like this, so you can see it kind of bubbling and appearing. So each time I click the mouse, a different part of the image will appear. And I've just done that on PowerPoint and then black squares over it. And then each slide, you just move. Each slide you take away one box, and between the slides you just add it as transitions. Anyway, so this is a section of a much larger picture, and I want them to really have a look at this picture and go, what can I see going on? And to really kind of pique that interest. Well, what are these people wearing? Are they male or female? What are they doing with their hands? One of the guys has got his hands up like this, the other guy's got his hands like this. Do they look like they're happy? Do they look like they're sad? What on earth is happening? And then gradually you would reveal a little bit more. What can we see in this element of the picture? So it looks like we've got some instruments, but how many people are there? There seems to be quite a few. What's that going to sound like? What's it going to feel like to watch this? They're all in a line. So does that suggest some kind of procession? And then we've got some characters over here. They look like they might be females, perhaps with children, maybe. The character on the left looks like she's trying to restrain the middle character. And then, there's some people who are on different layers. And gradually you would just discuss each different image as it all comes together. And what you want is the students to eventually be able to tell you, it looks like there's a funeral procession going on here. And this, I've chosen this as a carving on a sarcophagus. And I think it's a great way of introducing things like funerary rituals and superstition and what the Romans believed about life after death. And I would teach this as a kind of precursor to teaching that first picture about the tombs on either side. But also this one shows us not only do we have lots of music, where are they going with this procession? Look at how ornately decorated the person's bier is as well. And you can talk about the hired mourners, how funeral processions, really, really rich Romans would actually pay people to be mourners at their funerals. So it would be really, really loud. And obviously that shows the status of the deceased. So you can draw quite a lot out about funerary practices from this image, which is why I've chosen to start with this one as then a springboard to then talking about funeral practices in general. And that will lead us at the end of the lesson to looking at, or sort of halfway through towards the end of the lesson, to looking at picture 1. And then we can use the knowledge that we've had from the lesson to look at picture 1. So was a proper burial only important for wealthy Romans? That's the question I've chosen to go with this lesson. We can read the CLC, there's information there. There are some clips on YouTube. They're going into far too much detail. Like, you don't need to know all of that, but if you've got time, it's nice. Maybe a prediction. What about people who were poor? Could they be buried? What's this image? It's not one of the prescribed images either, but again, it shows us a different way that people might be buried, and it shows us that burial and funerary practices were important across the whole spectrum of society. And what about if you had no money at all? Well, how would you be buried then? And they would join those burial clubs so that they could pay like almost like an insurance policy, and then their mates would club together and bury them if they had very little money at all. So this shows us the significance of the afterlife. It wasn't just something that some people believed in and other people didn't believe in it. It was very much across Roman society. And this is where we come into our image, picture 1, of the tombs going out of Pompeii towards Herculaneum. So this picture very much links with the Petronius passage, where, as I've mentioned before, the soldier starts to kind of go through the tombs and have a look around before he turns into the werewolf. And this will help students to kind of picture in their mind what the scene is looking like, as it's Nicaros telling the story, isn't it? As he is narrating this kind of creepy story. And then, how much would you have to be paid to walk around here alone at nighttime? How creepy is this? And why would it be dangerous? Well, we know that the necropolis were outside the cities. So as you were walking into the city, you would be walking past the rows of the dead and thinking, my goodness, if this is how they bury their dead, how on earth do the living live? Like, when we get into the actual city. And also there's lots of creepy corners, there's lots of places for people to hide around. So in a nighttime, how many of us feel completely comfortable strolling through a churchyard at nighttime? It's a similar kind of thing. So that might be an interesting discussion point or question for students to try and get them to empathize with how creepy or scary that is. So, as I said, I chose to teach all of the pictures in one go together at the beginning before I've taught any of the literature. But you could say, I'm going to use this as a starter activity before I teach the Petronius passage as a springboard. This is where Nicaros and his Miles, his soldier, are hanging out when it actually happens and he turns into the werewolf. Why might Romans have been wary? What superstitions did they hold about the dead? And that's all of the dead were buried outside the city's sacred boundaries, outside the Pomerium, because they believed that they would the dead could create trouble for the living, or that they had this kind of disease around them, this kind of pestilence around the dead, and that they needed to be separate from the living. So by doing that, by making that separation between where the living live and where the dead live, anything therefore that is happening outside the city's boundaries is going to be spooky and superstitious. So we see that kind of idea coming up in a number of the passages, this idea of the other, things that are outside of the norm. When we look at Ovid's portrayal of Dipsas, how she's able to reverse nature and do things which are not normal or not accepted, that links in with this idea of the separation that is normal. It's accepted to have the dead away from you. So with this picture, an activity I might do with this, if they have not seen this one before, because you know what kids are like, they have a tendency, if one of them knows, they'll go, I know what it is, miss, it's the bronze liver, and that's ruined your whole activity. So if your kids have done Cambridge Latin course, then they might recognise this from the Harrispex section in book 3, but they might have forgotten. So you could try this. What do you see, think, and wonder about this object? I like this because it doesn't matter if they don't know anything about it at all. And I think that's the point, to try and get them to, what can you physically see? What shape is it? What does it look like it's made from? What do you think it is? Let's have some predictions about it. It's got like, is it for, I don't know, combing a cat or something? It's got like a handle bits on top of it. Do you hold it? So that's leading you, so it looks like it's something that you hold in your hand. And then what do you wonder, who used this? And it just helps the kids to kind of think this is not just some metal blob. This is something special, something magical, bit mystical about it. And that's, of course, the bronze liver from Etrusca. That links in with the idea that magic is, things that are from Etruria were considered to be more ancient than just normal Roman things, and therefore it had a link with, it's kind of extra magical because it's old. Even for the Romans, it was old. And then you might want to use this. I taught this picture at the same time as teaching the image of the sacrifice as well going on, because there's the haruspex there. There's also, you can see the picture, I think one of the augurs or one of the haruspexes is actually holding one of these, so it's quite handy to link those two together. And then I think we taught a lesson where we read the Cambridge Latin course material about haruspexes, and then at the end of the lesson, I gave them all a big bit of yellow paper and got them to create an entrails for dummies. How do you do this? What is a haruspex? And that's on the Eduqas specification. It says they need to be familiar with the work of a haruspex and things like that. So for that, I did use the Cambridge Latin course. There wasn't an awful lot on the internet about it. There was a video on YouTube, which I quite enjoyed because it showed lots and lots of different carvings of different haruspexes, and that allowed me to ask students what are the similarities between, what can we see that all haruspexes did, or what were the links between them all. None of them were prescribed images, but I don't think that's a problem. Right, and then this is another activity I did with one of the pictures, and this was the image, I think, of Augustus. So I got the whole class, so I've got one person to come up, and of course they don't know what they're volunteering for, and so there's the mystery there. They come up to the front of the board, and the rest of the class then looks at that picture of the sacrifice being performed. They then have to describe that picture to the student who's come to the board, and the student has a board pen and has to try and draw it on the board based on the rest of the class's descriptions. That, I like this activity because it forces the rest of the class to look really carefully at the picture, and they don't even need to have any information to be able to tell you that if the guy on the right, it looks like he's holding an axe. What's he wearing? Well, he's not wearing a shirt. Why on earth is he not wearing a shirt? Well, presumably he's going to be the one who performs the sacrifice, so he's going to get completely splattered. So you don't want him, you don't want to have to launder all of those clothes. But then they have to describe the bull. Is it a bull? What's the bull wearing? Where are they? Look at that altar. It's actually not inside a temple. That you can lead on to discussions about how Roman altars were outside of the temples. Why was that? To encourage lots of people to attend so that everyone could see what was going on, but also because the temple in Roman times and Greek times was sacred for the priests. So it's not like a modern church where the congregation goes inside the church. In antiquity, they would perform all of their sacrifices outside. Also, you don't want to have loads of blood in your temple just for practical reasons. So then you say, well, what's on the altar? You can see that it looks like there's flames going on there. Who are the figures on the left? We've got one guy who seems to have his hair covered. Why has he got his hair covered? And that's something, again, we see lots and lots in religious activities. When we look at the picture of Augustus as an augur, he also has his hair covered as well. So that you can link that to SMSC discussions about religions who cover their hair for religious reasons. And what is that person doing? Well, it looks like he's being offered something on a tray. Is that a servant or is that a helper? do we think that this is for rich people or for poor people? I think that's likely to be the sort of question that might come up with superstition and magic, sort of how accessible was superstition to everybody, to the whole of society. We can see that this is obviously going to be people who are quite wealthy. A bull is a large, expensive animal. You're not going to be having your average Joe who can afford to sacrifice a bull. So this would be, and also this is state religion rather than individual religion. When we see something like the De Fictiones, the curse tablets, they're very much an individual's link with the divine and with superstition. This is the state version. So that as well might raise some questions with students about about our state. I know that there are some countries who completely separate state and religion, but in the UK, the head of the UK, I know, is the Queen of England. I know it's a ceremonial position, but she's also the head of the Church of England. So in theory, we kind of have a similar link like that ourselves, but for the Romans, that was much stronger, wasn't it? They couldn't do things like going to war or having political elections. They couldn't do any of that unless they had taken their auguries, or unless they had looked at the entrails. So for them, religion and politics was really, really linked. One of the things that my students seemed to really fixate on, they seemed to love it, was this idea of corruption, that your haruspex or your augur was being paid off, and he could just tell you whatever you wanted to hear, so that you would pay him well, and you would get the omens that you wanted in order to be able to carry on with your activity. That they seem to really, really like that idea, but also that links with the the Suetonius one about Caesar, and how he keeps repeating his auguries, with his haruspex, he keeps repeating his sacrifices to try and get good omens. And so again, that shows that the Romans had to do things really, really precisely and perfectly, otherwise they felt that they had been given, they wouldn't get the omens that they wanted. So I might link this one with that Julius Caesar passage by Suetonius. Also, what I quite like about this is that it's a carving of an altar on an altar. I like that kind of like double layering, perhaps adds to the magic as well. Excuse me. Just as we're going through, do stop me, because I'm on like a complete mouth journey. If you have any questions, do just put your camera on, or your microphone on, and ask as we're going through. So when I find out that the texts are going to change, how do I go about preparing those texts? Well, it's usually with some feeling of, I'm going to have to give up. I'm going to have to go through and properly, I'm not the sort of Latinist who can just read a passage of Latin and go, oh, that's nice and easy. It doesn't take me 10 minutes to prepare the text, and I definitely couldn't go into a classroom and just teach that martial passage having not prepared it myself. So it does take some time. And what I've done this summer is I've kind of blitzed it. And what I found really helpful this year, I have done it in previous years as well, but this year in particular, I prepared the text, and then on my phone, I've done like a podcast of it as well, of me going through my notes that I've just made. So therefore, I've gone through it twice, so I feel like I know it really well. And then that podcast I will then put on Teams for my students as their revision. So they've literally got a lesson. It's just me reading through all of the notes that I've just made. And so I don't have to. Also, if a kid comes and says, oh, miss, I wasn't there for that lesson, you're like, oh, go and listen to it on Teams then. And that's all there. And I've done that for the future. So although it was a pain in the bum to make, and it took ages, I've saved myself time in later. So the first place that I went to is the teacher's notes. I think that's really, really helpful. They do state in them, which is also important to note, they state students don't need to know everything that's in here. This is for the teachers, for you to know this. And they go into lots of detail and lots of depth. It's very interesting. So I quite enjoy preparing the text, even if it is time consuming. And I'm old school in that I do it all in a book. I get a blank exercise book and I stick the Latin on one side and the translation at the bottom, and I go through the teacher's notes and make notes like this. I also then scan these in and put these on Teams as well. Once I've taught the extract, I put these on Teams so the students can have them for their revision. Also, that my reason for doing that is because I want the kids to see this is what I want them to be making in their books, not just. One of the things I find when you go through a passage of literature is you can then walk around the classroom at the end of the lesson, and some this is sexist, but some girls have made these most beautiful notes, and don't they look lovely, and it's all color coded. And then like I have a particular boy in mind, had just written like 2 words, like there's alliteration, going, oh. So it's really frustrating if you've taught your whole lesson really, really well, and there's some students who've got no notes down at all. So I have got these notes for the students to access as well when it comes to their revision. And I kind of covered my back with the podcasts as well. One of the things, again, the kids wouldn't necessarily need to have this much depth, but you can see I've highlighted words like imperatives, apostrophe, polysyndeton, anaphora. I think there's a tendency to try to get bogged down in some of these kind of literary words, which they don't necessarily need to know the word polysyndeton. They just need to know that the authors use lots of ands, lots of ques, or lots of ets, and what's the effect of that, and why have they chosen to use lots of ands. It's made it into a list, or it's made it really long. So I try not to get bogged down too much on literary language like that, but I actually quite like it. Right, this is where I have gone to my English department, and I have said, what poems have they already studied in year 10? Every single student should already have studied these poems when they're in year 10. Therefore, if I were to put these up in year 11 on a board in a Latin lesson, they would at least recognize the poem. So my husband says they have already studied Thomas Hardy's Neutral Tones. And this one I thought was particularly good because it's got a line. If you look in the 3rd stanza. Oh, is someone asking a question?
No, I think maybe just a bit of feedback there, Ginny.
Right. Okay, so in the 3rd stanza on the 4th line, it says like an ominous bird a wing. And I thought that links really nicely with the superstition and magic thing. So that's why I quite liked this poem. And also it's quite dark, and it's sort of, anyway, so I'm not going to go through this poem in any great depth, but what I thought you could do as a starter activity would be to put a poem which is familiar to the students on the board, and then they can go through and see where has Thomas Hardy used alliteration, where has he used repetition, has he got any similes, has he got any metaphors, some of the really basic kind of literary devices. And having it in English, not only is it in English, it's also a poem they've already studied, should hopefully be nice and supportive for them. So they are really recognizing these are skills that they have already. They know how to spot alliteration and what's the effect of alliteration. And through doing that, I would then hope to get them to encourage them to create a glossary of terms, language that they can use to describe language, like hyperbole or exaggeration or juxtaposition and enjambment. All of those are things that are going to come up in the passages. And if they know them already, there's no point teaching it to them again in a Latin-y way when they already know it in English. So I'm really trying to emphasize to students that these skills are completely transferable. Everything they've learned in English is going to be useful here in Latin as well. Also, I really like that line in the 3rd stanza, which says, the smile on your mouth was the deadest thing, alive enough to have the strength to die. And that juxtaposition between life and death, alive and dying as well, it's kind of oxymoronic. And this poem has got some good bits for you to then use as a springboard to looking at the Latin. So how are you planning to kind of teach the poems? I know that the Eduqas booklet has them in a certain order, but that's not prescriptive. You don't have to teach them in that order. Personally, I always start with the shortest poem, just because when students see a big passage of Latin, even if they're really, really capable linguists, if you see a passage in a language that is not your mother tongue, you're likely to be feeling overwhelmed by it. So when I teach this, I will start with the Marshall extract because it's the shortest. I also think that one's quite easy to access as well. It happens to come first in the booklet as well, but yeah, that's just luck, I think. And I usually save Virgil to the end, and sometimes Ovid towards the end as well, because both of them have got a lot of stylistic devices which are pretty easy to spot. So it's nice for you to have kind of scaffolded the students through the first few extracts and then leave the ones that have got some nice obvious, they can be a bit harder, but they have got some obvious stylistic devices towards the end, and then they should be able to tell you the extracts, or be able to tell you what they can spot by that stage. So kind of building up that progression of difficulty towards the end. I will probably teach Horace second after I teach Martial, simply because I like the links that they have together. They're also both poetry. I think students, they don't need to, but they kind of get hung up on the idea that poetry should rhyme, and Latin poetry of course doesn't, and then it's difficult to show them that it's in a particular rhythm. So at least if you've got your first two extracts are poetry rather than a poem and then prose, then I think it's nice you can draw those comparisons, and also Horace is the kind of next shortest one, so they'll link together nicely. And also if you've got some links between the poems, then you can start early on asking students what kind of exam questions might the exam board ask. Now obviously we're in a peculiar situation this year, because although the set texts were taught last year, we don't have any past papers to go on. I know Eduqas have given forth a couple of potential larger 12-mark exam question ideas, but there haven't been there isn't a past paper that we can use, so we don't know what extracts would have come up last year and which way to like tailor our teaching. Like, Martial came up in the exam last year, so I'll leave him till last this year. We don't know anything. So the earlier we can start thinking about exam questions, the better. And then this is something that I deliberate on quite a lot when I'm thinking about how do I teach the literature. I know that some colleagues teach a passage, when they go to one passage, so let's start with Martial, do they spend one lesson, some of them spend one lesson just doing a translation, and then the next lesson they might do literary criticism, and then the third lesson might be revision, and then they might move on. So do you translate it as a class together first and then do literary criticism? I find that personally I find that difficult, because I enjoy literary criticism so much. I find it difficult to restrain myself when we're going through and translating it. I can't not mention alliteration, especially then if the student goes, oh miss, isn't that funny because that is in Jean-Vermont there. It's really difficult to do a translation without talking about the literary criticism. So personally I tend to kind of do it both at the same time, and then end up having two lessons which are simultaneously translation and literary criticism at the same time. With a passage that's the length of Martial, I would probably spend maybe 2 lessons doing Martial before moving on. Obviously with longer passages like Virgil, I would probably spend 2 weeks on the Virgil one. And we have 6 lessons a fortnight, so it's roughly equates to 3 a week, so it's about 5 hours a fortnight. Yeah, again, I always find that I never have quite as much time as I would like to go over the literature, but the question, do you go through each text completely and really, really thoroughly once and spend plenty of time on each one, so you've given them all the information on it? Or do you go through the passages relatively quickly, so you've got to the end, you know that everyone's been taught it once, and then start back at the beginning and go through it again as revision? I think there's benefits to both ways of doing things. The second way, I think, is, well, I mean, I don't know. They say that you have to see a word 12 times, don't they, before it goes into your long-term memory. And I kind of feel like if you are going through, the more you go through the passages, the more it's going to go into the students' minds, I think. So I will probably go through them relatively swiftly. I'll do both language and lit crit as we go through, and then hopefully leave some time to go back through all of the passages for a second time. We have, so at our school, well, probably the same at your school, we've got their mocks in November. So I'm going to give them a literature mock in November. So I'm really going to spend this term completely blitzing the literature, because they've done a fair amount of the language. They're nearly there really on the language. So we're going to blitz the literature this term, and then I will come back a little bit more to language just before Christmas and leading up to they have a next set of mocks in March, which I'm going to give them language for. So this is this is a sample scheme of work. I don't know if I'm going to stick to this, but when I was planning the session, I thought, well, how would I go about doing this? So I would spend longer on Horace because it's a longer extract. So I've put lesson 1 for Marshall, examining familiar vocabulary and preparing unfamiliar vocabulary. I remember when I was doing my GCSE Latin, my teacher was very keen that we would prepare the Latin in advance. So for our homework, she would say, right, here's the passage, and she'd do it like double line spacing or triple line spacing, and we would have to, with a pencil, go home with the dictionary, and any words that we didn't know the vocabulary for, we would just pencil it in above the words. And so then when we came to the lesson, the language wasn't a barrier anymore because you knew what each individual word meant, and then we would go through with her and do the translation and the literary criticism together. That would be lovely if my students did that. I have tried doing that with them and saying, can you go away and prepare the text? And they just come back and they've not done it. Or they go, oh, I didn't really know what you meant by preparing it. Even if you show them in the lesson, I can't trust that all of my students are going to go away and do that. And my worry is that one of the students will do it, and then all the other kids will just go, oh, give me a paper and just write it on top. So it's, in practice, for me, that's not worked. I just prefer to do it all together in class, because that way I know that they have done everything. So I thought I would start as a springboard, like, tell me about your own dreams with Marshall. There's something on Netflix at the moment called The Mind Explained, and one of the episodes is about dreams, and they had this neuroscientist on who said he specializes in dreams, and he says whenever he goes to a dinner party and he says, oh yes, I'm a neuroscientist and I specialize in dreams, he says the first thing everyone does is tell him one of these wacky dreams that they've had, and he says it is so boring. I don't want to hear about your crazy dreams. When you hear about someone else's dreams, they're really, really boring. So I thought that might be discussing what are some of your wacky dreams. How do you feel when other people tell you their dreams? Not as sort of interested as they think you're going to be. And so when we're then hearing Marshall talk about Nasidianus's dreams, and he's saying, well, Marshall is actually taking Nasidianus's dreams seriously. Is he enjoying hearing about Nasidianus's dreams? Or how is it making him feel when he hears about them? So I thought that would be, that might be a nice springboard to start talking about it. Finish preparing the unfamiliar vocabulary for homework. Well, if they do it or if they don't. And then in lesson 3, I thought having a vocab quiz, because that will, again, the more they see that unfamiliar vocabulary, the more it's going to go into their mind, and then it just won't be unfamiliar anymore. An activity I like to do when we're thinking about the exam is imagine that you are the examiner. What exam questions might you ask? Then we write them, or we might do them in pairs, or we might do a kind of a collaborative thing where each group has to think up their own exam question, and then we swap, or something like that. Then it doesn't feel quite so much like I, the teacher, am telling them what the exam questions are, because also I don't know the exam questions because we've not got a paper. And then Horace, I might start my Horace extract by looking at, in our modern culture, what are the sorts of creatures that we associate with good omens and bad omens. We might talk about black cats crossing a road, and things like that. Also to do with birds. What birds do we consider to be good omens or bad omens, and why? And then even before you've looked at Horace, you might be able, even before you've translated it, you might be able to show the students the passage and then say, can you see any names of creatures already, and get them to pull it out for you. What already do we think these are good creatures, or bad, or negative or positive, as a way of getting them to see that actually they probably know a lot of the vocabulary already. Pair work, if I haven't taught it to them first, then I don't tend to get them to do pair work, just because they do, even if you just give them a couplet, in my experience, they tend to feel quite overwhelmed by this unfamiliar Latin. So I would probably teach it to them first, and use sort of pair work examination as a pair work analysis as like a plenary. But they could prepare the vocabulary of a different stanza together and feed back to the class. Anyway, so this is just a sample scheme of work, and I've certainly not done that for all of my activities, for all of the sessions yet, the passages. again, I'd be interested to hear, those of you who are experienced teachers, how you get the students to record your information. This is how I do it, because this is how my head of department when I was an NQT, this is how she did it, and I've just sort of never changed. So I again give them a blank exercise book, they stick the images in and they stick the text in, and I usually have them to have the text on one side and the vocabulary on the other side, so that they can, the translation on the other side, so they can see. And again, it removes that fear of the, oh gosh, I don't know what the Latin means. However, it's sometimes I don't necessarily give them the translation at the beginning of the lesson. I might just get them to stick the Latin in, then we'll do some translation and analysis together. And then at the end of the lesson, I might just give them a little bit of the translation that we've done in that lesson as a recap. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how you do it as well. This seems to be quite like old school to have books, and my biggest fear is that they will lose these books. So we always keep them in the classroom, that they get, so they don't take them home and then lose them, get them mixed up with their physics book or whatever. So in your first literature lesson, are you going to give them the translations before or after you look at the passage? Are they going to have the printed Eduqas booklet, which is quite good because it gives it in small chunks and it's got helpful vocabulary underneath as well? Or are they going to create their own books? Are you going to show them all the passages? Again, in my experience, they get overwhelmed. They're like, oh God, are we going to have to do all of these bits, all of these Latin bits? And so I sort of give it to them in chunks so they don't really realize how much set text they're going to have to do. And this is my biggest thing. I mean, I like teaching the literature anyway, but even when it's a bit of Cicero, you still got to start it with like, oh, I love Cicero, he's the best guy ever, and you just absolutely love this passage, it's your favorite passage, because otherwise the kids, they're already going to be feeling overwhelmed. It's a bit of a new, it is a new skill for them, in the sense that they've not had to do Latin literature generally before they've got to this stage at their GCSE. So some of them either love it or they hate it, and so it's really important that they are guided, I think, by your preferences as well. So if you start each passage with, oh my goodness, it's Ovid, I love teaching Ovid. I actually do, because we don't have Latin A level at our school, which is a real shame. So it's the only time I get to teach either Ovid or Virgil. So if you start with enthusiasm, the students will tend to be influenced by your positivity as well. And I think as teachers, we have this tendency to, because we want to over prepare and make sure that we know everything and we know all of the material for them, I feel like we have the tendency to try and give too much information to the kids. At this stage, this is GCSE, so they don't need to know how old Pliny was, or what his favorite toothpaste was. They don't need to know these characters inside out. They just need to know enough to be able to understand that author's motivation for writing that work, a little bit of the context, who was he, when was he writing. Virgil is writing in a very different climate and he has a very different relationship with the emperor to someone like Ovid. So you want to give them enough information, but not too much. When I first started teaching, I was quite sort of methodical about, right, now we're starting with the passage of Ovid. Lesson 1 is going to be Ovid's life story, and it's just not necessary. And the kids, for them, they're like, well, we don't even know who Ovid is, so this is really not very interesting. And I don't think it's necessary for their enjoyment of the text. So if I'm starting with Marshall, he's an interesting character because he's being tongue-in-cheek a lot of the time, and the same as someone like Ovid is. Horace as well went in here, and Ovid is usually tongue-in-cheek too, but Horace extract as well, he's not necessarily being entirely sincere, but the students can often find that really difficult to get their heads around. If they're not sort of lol, they're not laughing out loud at what Marshall is saying, therefore they're like, oh, it's not really that funny. You have to explain that if there's perhaps a political agenda here, or he is just trying to write a witticism. So I thought, well, why don't we look at some of Marshall's other poetry in English, and just get a sense of who is Marshall. So I would have this as a starter on the board, read through this with in pairs, and tell me, what do you think about this character Marshall? What is he being serious? So what sort of guy is he? He seems quite up himself. dedicated reader, the glory you've given him while he lives comes to few poets. You know, he sounds like he's really tooting up his own bum. And so that then gives us a springboard to talking about what Marshall is like in the Nasidianus poem. He's not being entirely serious all the time, is he? But the fact that he can poke fun gently at these superstitions and perhaps at people who do use up all of their resources going to see sorceresses and trying to interpret their dreams, he's poking fun at them in a way that perhaps with some of the modern religions, people might feel a bit, oh, is that blasphemy? Am I allowed to say that about religion? And it suggests that Marshall and perhaps certainly some echelons of Roman society might not have been completely serious about it all the time. So then, do you start by putting your full extract of Latin on the board? And Marshall is only, what is it, 8 lines long, so it's not too long. Do you start by showing them the whole extract and say, we're going to work through all of this? Or do you just go through it couplet by couplet or kind of clause by clause? With this, as I say, I'm not going to go through it line by line and teach it to you. But for me, I found the interactive text explorers on the CSCP website, I found those really, really helpful, because there are some words that, for example, FIChem on line 3, it's not a word that I've come across before, so I didn't know what it meant. And I found those interactive text explorers really helpful so that I can link each word with the translation. Yeah, and then what I would do with a passage like this is say, right, students, so even before we have gone through and translated it, can you see anything that is a little unusual? Let's read through it in the Latin together. Can you hear anything as I'm reading it, or can you see anything like repetition? You don't need to know what the Latin means in order to be able to spot repetition. Or why don't we go through with our highlighter and highlight all of the verbs? Some of them are coming up in really unusual places. We wouldn't expect a verb to be at the beginning. Why might we have a verb at the beginning? And that just helps the students to see that it doesn't all need to be content. There are other things that you can see too. And also then you've already read through the poem a couple of times before you even start translating it. So again, it's reducing any anxiety that they might feel about being given a passage of Latin like this. And of course, we've got Nasidianus's name. He is starting with a capital letter, so we know that's his name, and it's held to the end. Why might Marshall be choosing to hold this guy's name until the very end for suspense and delay? And the fact that we know that he's writing to someone tells us that this is an address and it's an apostrophe. There's an intended reader to this. So I might give them an A3 copy of the Latin. For some reason, if you blow it up on A3, they think it's a fun lesson. Even if you're just going through and translating some Latin, if it's on A3, they love it. So I might get them to go through, write in green pen words that they know already, so that makes them feel relaxed. And then red vocabulary, give them all a copy of the text, a copy of the literature vocabulary, and go through and write the words they didn't know in red. And that might help them when it comes to their revision to focus their attention on the words they didn't know already. It also helps them to see that they know a lot of the vocabulary already. What do they think the extract might be about based on the vocab that they already know? They can kind of get a gist of what's going on, and then they can prepare the rest of the text. So yeah, starter activity, I kind of talked about this. Can you tell me about a strange dream that you had? They really like talking about this. And when I was teaching the visual sources, they love talking about, oh, can you tell me a ghost story that you've heard? That seems to, you could spend a whole lesson listening to them talking about wacky ghost stories. Yeah, I kind of talked about this. Can you see anything already, even without knowing what the Latin means? Can you see any repetition or alliteration or unusual words? And then as you go, you want to be guiding the students to translate it themselves, rather than you saying, right, semper means always or every day, and mane means, you don't want to be just telling them the answer. You want to be guiding them. So you hope that there's 1 or 2 students who will recognize that naras is the verb, it's at the end. But can you tell me about the verb? It's in the second person, so he's talking to someone. How often is this happening? It's semper. Why is he started with that word? And so you really want to get them to tell you, well, it means always, why has he put that at the very start of the line? Oh, that's really emphatic. It sounds like he's doing it all the time. How else does he make it clear that it's happening all the time? He says mirror, he uses this word like up to the brim, isn't it? Or like everything of your dreams. So he's really trying to emphasize that you're telling me in absolute minutiae detail about these dreams. How does Marshall feel about it? Is he feeling chirpy about hearing all of these dreams, or not so much? And when you're going through and doing the literary criticism, I've put here in big, don't assume that because you've already translated the line that they still recall the meaning. If you translated the passage yesterday and you come back to it today to do the lit crit, just because you taught it yesterday doesn't mean they've learnt it. And I find that very frustrating, because you're like, oh, we literally just went through this. And there's always that student who hasn't been listening or who's been doodling or whatever. So what you might like to do in order to remove that is to then on the board to be writing the translation as you go, to have prepared yourself a PowerPoint or something, so that when it comes to doing the literary criticism, you've already got the vocabulary, you've already got the translation up there on the board. So that again removes that anxiety, and they can start focusing on things like word positioning, things like alliteration, and whatever. Other potential questions as you move through, but I'm not going to do this. So one of the questions with this one, I thought you could ask them, so with Windemia, which means like the vintage, why has Marshall chosen to use that word? Look at what word would you normally have chosen to use that to mean wine? You would use Wienum. Why has he chosen to use vintage instead? And just encouraging students to think about why the author has chosen that particular language. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to start to speed up. Sorry, I've just checked my watch. Different activity ideas for all of the different sections. Preparing the text, pre-reading, vocab quizzes. Get the students to make those vocab quizzes. That could be a nice extension activity that you could give a reward for or a merit for or something. Right, can you go home now and I want you to make a quiz for someone tomorrow about that vocabulary that we've just looked at? Can you get them to do as a plenary or as extension work to do a pair analysis and then perhaps present to the rest of the class? To making your own translation in comparison and then comparing it with the Eduqas translation. Are there some words that actually we'd prefer to translate in a different way? Being the examiner, so writing or planning exam questions, consolidating links with knowledge of the visual sources. And so I will get them to create a table with, I think it's on the next slide actually. Yeah, it's on this slide here, so the portrayal of soothsayer as being drunk, we can see that in Marshall and we can see that in Ovid, and getting them to do that. And it might this might take a couple of lessons, and they might need some guidance as well. And you might want to sort of fill in some bits of the table for them as a kind of signpost for them, but getting them to see the links, because that is what the larger questions at the end will be requiring them to do, to start making the links between all of the passages. So these are the two that Eduqas have given us as the kind of sample questions for 2021 examination. I suspect that they're going to be asking about, so they say in the first one, everyday lives of the Romans. I suspect they might ask us questions about rich versus poor, and about kind of individual versus state religion, and things like that. So with these, just like you would plan any exam questions, I have different activities that I like to do with them. I definitely like to give them model answers as well, to show them how a style of writing, not only does it get them to, they might learn some information, literally some content from reading a sample answer, but really looking at the structure of a sample answer and how to write a good one. I also, when they have done a question, will always photocopy a really good student's piece of work, and perhaps I ask them first, staple it to the back of everyone in the classes, which is a nice bit of praise for the student who's done really well, but also it shows them that it's not just a teacher that can write a really good sample answer. This person in the class, you know, Brian's written a great one as well. So it's within their means to do it. Collaborative essay plans, peer marking, you need a lot of structure with that at GCSE, I find. At A-level, they're slightly better, but you still need to set it up and train it with them. So you spend a whole lesson going through that. but they find it really valuable to have really engaged with the marking grids as if they're an examiner. They know then what is expected of them, what the examiner's looking for. And rewriting either a bit of their own, or rewriting a paragraph of their own essay, or rewriting someone else's to make it even better. So no one interrupted me as we were going through, which is very kind of you. Maybe you've all fallen asleep, but do you have any questions now?
Fantastic. Thanks, Ginny. Yeah, so any questions? I know there's a few things that have popped up in the chat.
I can't see that.
So early on, we had a question about how much teaching time do you have, or do we each have for the literature? So maybe we could share some sort of, experiences on that. When do you tend to start, Ginny? You said this time you did the images first, and then this coming year, I guess it's with the students in year 11.
Yeah, normally I save the literature. Sorry. Yeah, normally I save it right to the beginning of year 11, because I want their language to be competent. I want them to be competent enough at the language so that this is not it's not too far beyond them. But of course the language in the literature tends to be more complex than what they've seen in the language in the component 1 side of things. So I'll keep it for year 11, but I'm usually, so I find that they perform less well in the literature component than they do in either of the other 2. So I'm very keen to get it done quickly and to get it done as thoroughly as I can early on, so that we've got plenty of time to go over it again. So yeah, I would hope that this year that I have finished all of the literature and done some good revision of it before we get to Christmas. And then I will do some kind of final revision sort of literally in the month before they go on study leave.
And I think
where's the chat? There it is. Sorry, I've literally just found the chat. Sorry.
And you said something as you were going through about, the mocks coming up before Christmas. So you're going to focus on the lit. I think that's a really important point, isn't it? That if they're doing mocks before or after Christmas, it's a great chance, if you can get some literature questions in that mock, it's a great chance to get them to revise it all, or as much as you've done anyway, at Christmas time. Because otherwise it can be a long time between doing it and having a good sort of focus on it.
Yeah,
if it's not till May.
We've done it, I've taught it the other way as well, where with a colleague, where we shared a year 11 class and we had sort of 3 classes each per fortnight, and she would teach the language and I would teach the literature, so the students are having it parallel, as it were, throughout the whole year rather than having a blitz. Personally, I think that the students preferred having a big blitz and then coming back to it a bit later, rather than having to be like, oh, is today a language or a literature lesson? And I think it was just easier for them to compartmentalize it and be like, right, we've done all of that component, and it's easy for them to see, right, she's taught us that, and so they don't they feel confident that they've taught it everything.
Yeah, and Lucy, you're saying that you've got to get it all done in one term. And I think that there's a lot of us in that situation. I put a note in the chat earlier that normally in my teaching career I'm starting with students in year 9 starting Latin, and occasionally in year 10, and so I would often not start the lit till October half term of year 11, and I would look to cover it at around about 8 to 10 lines an hour. So I don't know whether that's quick or slow really, but if there's 110, 120 lines of literature, that at a minimum that works out as 12 hours, but I tend to pack stuff around that. So I would tend to sort of I'd want 20 hours overall for the lit as a rough minimum, but I would hit it all in one go.
I think that's roughly about the amount that I would get through in a lesson 2, so about 8 to 10 lines, and then obviously some poems you'll want to spend longer on than others because there's more to unpack from them, and then as you get further through the prescribed material, you'll be able to draw links, so the kind of chat about which poems link with other ones gets more as you go through, so you kind of slow down, you lose momentum towards the end, and like the Virgil passage tends to take ages to get through.
Yeah, I
There's
don't
so
know if
much in
others
there.
want to sort of chip in with sort of thoughts and ideas and pop our microphones on. I'll just say, and again, I think we're all a bit different. When I do the literature, I don't do anything else. So I give all my lessons over to lit, and I hit it all in one go. And I take the view really that, you know, obviously it's full of language. So I'm not worried about the fact that we're not doing language, because of course we're doing language. The thing is full of it, and you know, we'll come back to the sieve at some other point if it doesn't, you know, doesn't get picked up in the literature. So fairly comfortable just hitting it very hard. There's a question here from you, Vivian. Is there a reason for choosing magic instead of travel? I don't know if Ginny, you want to speak to that?
That was just my personal preference. I thought that I had a look at the travel things, and there's some interesting bits in there. I like teaching about Roman roads and things. I just thought that actually for our Civ component, we've chosen to do the Roman Britain one, and the Roman roads thing. I just thought there's a lot you can teach there to do with Britain, and I just preferred the superstition and magic one. I thought it was really interesting.
And I think that then comes back to what you were saying earlier, Ginny, about you've got to say, even if you find the content boring, you've got to convince the kids that it's the most exciting, interesting thing that you've ever seen.
I wonder if you asked the students as well, if you said, here are the two options, which would you rather do? I didn't ask the students, but I imagine they might say superstition and magic just because it sounds kind of spooky and weird. I'm interested in to hear from Lucy. She says, I don't have the time to do the literature all in one go because you only have 11 lessons. How are you going to teach the literature with the language?
Are you there, Lucy?
Hi. Yes, I find my whole Latin teaching life is driven by lack of time. Will probably recognises my name because I'm always in contact with him about using Subarani, which I'm hoping is going to transform my experience. But yes, I actually give them the English translation. We work from the English translation because I just don't have time. So we start with the English translation. And then, like you, I do a podcast, but I do it on Google Classroom. And I do two. I do one on mapping the Latin language to the English language of the translation. And I make booklets. I've got one I can just hold up and show you. So my students, this is my Petronius booklet. And they get, oh, no, that's not one I've done. Let's find. So I give them a booklet, and the booklet has got everything in it. It's got all the notes, it's got the English, it's got the Latin translation, and this is like your version of not letting them lose it. Yeah, so here's my version. So it has the Latin one side, it has the English the other, and I type all the notes into it from the contextual notes. But I have to work from the English initially. My students aren't that good at the Latin by the time we start doing the lit. I have to run another language lesson at the same time. Otherwise I won't get through the language. And so I do start with a translation. We're not a selective school, so I have kids who get 4s, and it's a really big effort to get them through, and I have to explain the English text to them. And I found with doing Magic and Superstition, unlike the one we were doing before, the Roman entertainment one, that they have none of that knowledge. Whereas when you were doing chariot racing, you could have one lesson introduction on chariot racing and then you could go because you got it all. Whereas this time you've got to do Roman ideas about superstition, you've got to do haruspexes, you've got to do sacrifices, you've got to do augurs, and it all just takes so much time that I'm constantly in a rush, that I give them everything in their booklet, and then we start from the English, and I have my 2 podcasts, one matching the English to the Latin, another one on all of the language features, and we do one and we move on to the next, do one and move on to the next. And I didn't get Virgil done at all last year, and that obviously didn't matter because of COVID. But this year I'm thinking, oh God, am I going to make it to the to the Virgil? And then we've got to do all of those linking the texts. So time for me is a really big issue, and I'm sure it is for lots of teachers. I work in a small independent school, so we have short terms and long holidays, and that for me actually just means I have less time to teach it. And I don't feel that Latin is a very important subject for the school, so kids are always being pulled out of my lessons to go and do this, go and do that, and I'm just like, you can't take them, I haven't got any time. So time for me, is just, I panic about time and about my scheme of work the whole time, and trying to do fun activities is just like, oh God, where am I going to put that in?
As you're saying that, Lucian, when some of the schools I used to work where they were just setting up Latin and time for them was really tight, and and this may not be possible, but occasionally they would say, look, they would talk to the SLT and say, rather than having an inset day, actually, can we get these kids in and we just have a full day of Latin with them at the start of a term or the end of the term or after? That obviously there's a limit. You can't, brain, it gets sort of full, doesn't it, after a while, but you can get a sort of good 4 or 5 hours of content in there, and that it can, certainly for some of the schools I work with, took a lot of pressure off just the rest of the year. So I don't know whether your SLT would be open to that, whether the students would be up for coming, but maybe that
it's deeply unfair when you're constantly having to struggle for Latin to have the kind of recognition that it deserves, that it's not a peculiar eccentricity, that it's a subject which in some circumstances people think of it as being really, really difficult and intellectually elite. It doesn't necessarily need to be that, but it is tricky. It's not just it's not just learning about Pompeii, is it?
And I find my students really do struggle with the literature. Partly because we're having to do it at speed, partly because their language skills are not good enough by the time we start doing it. And also, they're not always the super bright kids, so they don't like it in English, let alone, trying to do it in a foreign language.
I find that when you've got a student who doesn't like doing English literature, and then you say, right, and now we've got the Latin literature, a lot of so the students that I teach have chosen Latin because they didn't like French very much, and they were like, well, at least with Latin I get to do the civilization, I don't have to speak the French. And then you whop them with the literature, and you can just see their faces how do you motivate a student that doesn't even like English literature? That's why it's really, for me, it's really important that I am passionate about the topic that we're doing, and that hopefully I think that would drip down to them as well to try and enthuse them about it.
I sometimes too sort of encourage them a bit. I sometimes say to them, look, actually this is not significantly different to the text that we've been reading, whatever reading course we're using, but actually this is quite nice because you're going to get to to see this, to learn it up in advance, and that it's like having questions on texts you've already seen. And I suppose if you're using a reading course where the stories are 20-30 lines long, then the literature section is roughly sort of 4 to 5 stories, isn't it? So that can be a way of getting to think, actually this isn't such a big deal. There's a note from Liz to say, please visit the ARLT website for more resources as well. Thanks, Liz, arlt.co.uk, for more support with that. The little tip that Bob, when I was training years and years ago, said to do for literature, and I've always done this, is to say to the kids, look, if we've got one homework a week, which might be 40 minutes or whatever it is, to instead say, let's do a deal. Rather than having that one homework a week, we're going to have sort of 2 or 3 smaller homeworks a week, where after every lesson you go away and you learn up the bit that we've just done in this lesson. So you might spend 10-15 minutes after each lesson doing that, and then that sort of helps, Ginny, with that thing that you were saying. If we did this yesterday, immediately can't remember. And I
And
used
the
to
repetition as well, which is so important for any language learning, but also for literature. I think repetition as many times as you can go through it, and if they're going through it at home by themselves as well to consolidate, then that's so much the better.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions or comments? Is there anything in the chat we've missed? I want to say, Ginny, in advance, you said, well, you know, am I teaching people to suck eggs and so on? There are quite a number of things there that I thought, oh, why didn't I do that? This idea of starting with just a bit of an image, you know, and then looking in at that and then revealing more and getting and having that bit on the board as they come in. It's great. You know, I've been to however many sessions on literature I've been to for years. I've never come across that. So that is absolutely, you know, that and lots of other things there that you've put, and you know, revealing that gradually and getting the kids to describe the image to somebody with a board pen. Fantastic. You know, all these little things that make it more lively. Thanks, Ginny.
I hope you found it useful, and if anyone wants to email me, if you want to give me any of your resources, or I can share anything with you, then please do email me. It's at the beginning of this PowerPoint, which I've also sent to you, haven't I, Will, so you can put it up.
Yeah, we'll pop that up on the website. Thanks, Ginny. And you know, just to say to everybody, this is a sort of a self-help group, really. So if anybody else feels like they'd like to do a session on either a particular bit of literature or maybe one of the the Civ topics that's set, then you know, feel free. We can easily set that up. So yeah, anything we can all do to help each other would be fantastic. Pantelis, you're saying daily life will be, I thought you were going to say, Pantelis, daily life is something I'd be happy to do a session on, but Pantelis is saying daily life would be useful. So if anybody feels up for that, then just shout. Okay, thanks everybody. Ginny, thanks so much. And I guess we'll wrap it up there. All right. Okay. And I'll pause the recording at that point. Cheers. Bye, everybody.